Hello, and welcome to today's event, Creating a Modern Government Workforce. This is Bill Riles, Senior Fellow for the Center for Digital Government and IT Professor at Tulane University. And I'm excited to serve as moderator for today's event, and I just want to say thank you for joining us. I know we're in for an informative session over the next 30 minutes. We have a few housekeeping notes for you on the screen. Also, during today's webcast, you'll be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. For those of you on Twitter, please use hashtag GovTechLive to share key takeaways, quotes, and learnings from today's webcast. Joining me today to discuss this very timely topic are Mig Diaz, Chief Operating Officer, Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development for Massachusetts, and Paul Lipinski, State and Local Government Industry Leader for KPMG, Transformation Delivery Practice. Mig was originally born in Puerto Rico. She moved stateside at the age of 3 and was raised by a strong, hardworking mother who passed along her work ethic and passion for giving back. Armed with that work ethic and the determination to go to college, Mig spent 8 years in the CT Army National Guard, which remains the most empowering experience of her life. She spent the next 17 years working in the private sector, nurturing her interest, giving back to the community. This culminated her role as president of the Association of Latino Professionals for America in the Boston chapter from 2013 to 2015, and then as chief operating officer for that organization nationally. The COO role combined her desire to give back with her expertise in the company operations. In December of 2017, Mig was recruited for the role of Chief of Staff for the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce and Development. And of April 2021, she was promoted to Chief Operating Officer. Her time at the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development allows her to focus her efforts to the residents of the Commonwealth. Paul is a state and local government industry leader in KPMG's Transformation Delivery Practice. He has 24 years of experience in organizational change management, workforce evolution, organizational transformation, and change leadership. Paul's client experiences span the development and implementation of internal change management capabilities, organizational design, and integrated changes, aligning the people to strategy and technology to efficiently bring speed and efficiency to state and local government clients. Paul and the teams he has led has positively changed the lives of over 118 million residents across 13 different states. Most importantly, Paul believes in bringing in humanness or human elements, compassion, kindness to all technology transformations is key to success because people are the center of all organizations. Just to set the stage for today's discussion topic, IT modernization is a common term that we'll all hear. It comes up in just about every conversation involving government improvement, government technology, GovTech as we like to call it. How are we going to modernize this legacy system or modernize citizen engagement channel? Or our website is outdated and needs to be modernized. Unfortunately, all of these conversations typically are centered around technology or in terms of improving processes or bettering the overall citizen experience. But the most of the challenges, barriers, or roadblocks to government IT modernization have nothing to do with the technology, but rather the organizational structure, people, and culture. The question for today is, how does modernization affect your internal workflow, and especially your employees, your overall workforce for your agency? We can't have a discussion about government modernization without highlighting the government's response to the pandemic last year. The pandemic forced governments to react quickly and implement changes at a rate never before seen in government, all the while forcing employees out of the office to work remotely. Due to the innovative use of technology, government agencies found a way to make non-traditional government workflows and processes a success. But 2020 was all about survival. Now in 2021, how can the public sector maximize this shift to modernization? Since we're in the mid-2021, we're talking about post-pandemic planning. What happens when we go back to normal, whatever that is anymore? This kind of reminds me of the ship Theseus. If you're not familiar with this, the Thesis Paradox is an ancient thought experiment that ponders whether a ship is still the same object once all the wooden planks have rotted and been replaced. The story goes when Theseus returned victorious, the ship was stored as a memorial and remained floating in Athens harbor for centuries. As normal maintenance happened, rotting boards were replaced as needed. Over the course of time, eventually every board on the ship was replaced, pondering the question, is it still the same ship? If it's not the same ship, then when did it cease becoming the official ship of Theseus? If it is the same ship, then that means that individual elements do not really matter in the big picture perspective. Whenever we do return to normal, this normal will be different, or will it? Some individual things may be different, but the sense of the new normal, some things do not necessarily have to be, or I would argue should not have to be the exact same to be considered normal. According to a recent KPMG survey, 72% of senior executives said that outdated technology has hindered their ability to effectively recruit talent. Younger generations simply don't want to work in a place that's completely different than things they've experienced. So that normal office culture is changing, but it could still be normal. This resonates well with me. During my time as an IT government executive, not only did I have a difficult time attracting new talent, but also keeping them. I'm not exaggerating when I say that many of the systems that we were supporting were implemented before I was born. And that's exponentially highlighted with a younger workforce. I'm looking forward to talking with our expert speakers today to learn more of how we can capitalize on this opportunity. With that, I think I've rambled along long enough. Let's get started talking to our expert speakers. So Mig, I want to start off with you. You know, we were talking earlier, and I know that you've worked with Paul and his team on a really awesome project to transform one of your departments. Can you just share a little bit of that story about that project and what you were aiming to achieve?
Sure. So one of the things, I'll provide this context. One of the things that I was asked to do when I first joined government as chief of staff was to understand really not just the operations of everything, every agency that we oversee, but also to understand, you know, what is it going to take for us to get us to a point where we better serve our constituents. And that was really the bottom line. Our secretary's aim and goal at the end of the day is to serve our constituents in the best way possible. And one of the things I started to discover as we started to dive into those conversations was that there was a lot of things that were getting in the way of that. Some of which stemmed from technology, but it also had to do with how people use technology and how people kind of react to the environment that they're in. And so when I came back to the secretary, I said, look, there's a lot that we have to do here, and it's really beyond technology. I think that's a great starting point, but if the folks that are using that technology and whatever business processes we put in place aren't sold on it, and they don't embrace it, and they don't really understand how that's impacting the life of the constituent that we're ultimately trying to serve, then we fail anyway. And so we were looking at one particular group, our economic research group, that really just was very clear to us had a lot of opportunity in terms of the way that we could potentially serve our constituents, but also there are so many stakeholders that I think we could have served and could be serving that we weren't, simply because we hadn't really done the research around, you know, what are your needs and what would be helpful. But one of the points was really connecting all of our employees to how people use the data and how people can engage with that and what is the kind of overall impact that they could have. So we were really clear from the outset that when we were talking about transforming this particular group, that it was more than just providing them with great technology. That had to be part of the solution, but it also had to be a cohesive conversation around how do our employees connect with the work that they're doing? Do they really understand the impact that they can have? And are we really leveraging them in a way that utilizes their talents, utilizes their interest? So it became a really inclusive conversation around the entire work environment with the employee as the focus.
Thank you, Mig, for sharing that outstanding story. I was taking some notes as you were sharing. I got several questions I want to ask you, but speaking of questions, I want to remind our audience members that you can submit questions as well. We would love to hear from you. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we've got some time dedicated this webinar to address as many of your questions as you have. So following along with that, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you. Meg shared an outstanding story. So, and she used you guys as a partner. Can you tell us how KPMG approached this assignment?
Sure. We approached it from a lens of collaboration, a partnership, and empathy. And I want to go back to a couple of points that Meg made. And typically, collaboration, you'll hear quite a bit. Partnership, you'll hear as you do assignments like this. But the empathy became really the central focus for us as we sat down and talked to Meg and her team. Empathy, because as you said at the beginning, Bill, the heart of everything that we do is people. And it's the constituents, which is the ultimate goal of the work that's done in the states and in the Commonwealth. But it's the constituents that get served by the employees. And humans want to be treated like humans. And we're talking about not just technology here, we're talking about organizations. We're talking about structure. We're talking what people do day in, day out. We all know that historically, government workforces are in place for a very long time. They get very accustomed to certain ways of doing things. And so at the heart of that, there has to be a deep understanding and empathy of what they're going to go through. And that's the way that we approached it with the LMI group. Not only did we bring a level of expertise to Meg and her team, but we also brought that compassion also. And it made for a very good upfront portion, which typically could be very bumpy when we're talking about organizations, because everybody automatically wants to go to a line and box type conclusion. And that became, for us, the crescendo with Meg and her team towards the end of the organization, towards the end of the engagement.
So Meg, let's go back to the starting point. There was probably some reasons or some challenges out there of why you started a project like this. Can you give us a context of where you were starting from?
Yeah, I mean, the reality that we were living in was one where we would get, there are certain reports that the group would create around, what the unemployment rate was, and there are a lot of calculations that would happen just on a regular basis. And then we would get these requests from other agencies or from the Gov's office or what have you, asking us for data. And so it always felt a little bit like a scramble. And it also felt like the data wasn't logically connected in a way that it probably should have been. And that really started us down a path of asking a lot of questions around, what have we gathered? What information do we have at our fingertips? And then how does that work? As we started to ask those questions, we started to get a lot of questions from our employees who we started to realize just didn't understand the myriad of ways that people could really use their data to help make decisions. And I know that sounds really vague, but there's so many different data points, right? And so one of the things we talked about is, hey, we have, for example, people that are on unemployment and we're trying to help them get jobs. And wouldn't it be great if we could better understand that human experience, if we could marry the data around that person's whole experience within government, right? What if we could say, oh, they're receiving this kind of assistance and that. Imagine what we could create in terms of the way that we help our constituents solve their issues if we actually had a broader picture of their reality. And as we started to have those conversations, our employees started to get more interested in that. And that's where we really thought, we need help with this, right? This is the kind of transformation that really needs thoughtful leadership with a group of people that just do this for a living. I mean, I think anyone who works in government pretty much understands that you have very limited minutes in the day and they all seem taken up. And we didn't want to approach this as a team with the best of intentions, but not really having the experience or the time to do this thoughtfully in a way that was really going to cause the kind of transformation that we were looking for. And in talking with the different groups, that was really one of the considerations that we had, which is what team of people really gets where we're coming from, understands what we're trying to accomplish, and really speaks to the value they can bring to the table within the context of culture, really is what we're trying to do, is a cultural shift that's complemented by business process and technology.
Well, I really think it's empowering that you had the foresight in the future thinking to go beyond the technology and realize that it's to make this level of transformation, there is a cultural element, a people element. And so, Paul, my understanding that, Meg engaged you guys, you had this assignment, and you told us about some of the high-level framework, but can you give me some examples of some of the activities and steps that KPMG employed during this assignment?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Bill. Not to sound cliche, we started with an in-depth assessment of, for lack of a different term, a current state. But it's not a true current state assessment with state and local government, because current state is a snapshot in time. We started with a very thoughtful look back, almost a history of how the organization evolved. And that was partly predicated on the fact that we were talking to a group of people where operating model hadn't changed in, I believe, Meg, over a decade when we first started working with you. It had been in place. So we didn't want to just start with where things were today. We wanted to not repeat what has occurred and what has worked over the past decade. So we started with that. Through close partnership, we did that through a series of interviews, series of one-on-ones, series of focus groups. We also, as we got downstream and developed a new target operating model, we also really played out that operating model through a series of persona activities where we started to run through what the day in, day out life was for an employee with an actual group of constituents that might come in, or customers that might be asking for economic data. And I think, Meg, correct me if I'm wrong, we did a half dozen of those or so, and that proved to be very rich because we were then able to take that guidance and really start to put together a set of processes as we started to unfold the operating model. And this is going downstream a bit, that were actually something which was tested of sorts. So we weren't putting it out there for the first time. And lastly, this was all about organizational transformation and helping people do things differently. We put together, to support the adoption model then, a really robust organizational transformation plan and change management plan to wrap around that. So then the day, and I said this to Meg and her staff, the day that we turned the keys to the car over to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and they moved to the left seat and we moved to the right seat, they felt like they were in a place where the model could then become almost accretive for them and start to scale.
So, Meg, Paul just said he didn't want to sound cliche, so I have a cliche question for you. Okay. So tell me, what, in your opinion, what was the key? What was the one key element to this transformation? What was key for success?
I think I would say there are at least two keys that have to play hand in hand, right? So one is you need to have leadership, and I would say, and I include KPMG in that sense, right? But leadership in the group that's doing the work, but also leadership that is in the department that buys into and understands the impact of this work, because they are the ones that continue championing it on beyond you, right? The second is one of the things I learned when I first started in government was that there is often this expectation, because employees, or at least our employees, are here for a long time. And so there tends to be this attitude of, oh, you're with a particular administration, or you're kind of here for a couple of years, we're just going to ride you out. And so we had a consistent message throughout the way is that our intention was to create change that was going to last beyond us, that would benefit our constituents. And in order to benefit our constituents, we had to empower our employees. And having that consistent message along with the leadership that really bought into this, those two things together is what I truly believe is what has made this successful.
We're starting to get some really good questions from our audience members. Before we get to those, I still have a few more questions for you guys. So remind our audience to continue to submit your questions. We've got a few minutes dedicated at the end of this webinar to address as many of your questions as possible. So Paul, I want to ask you about best practices. You're a leader in this space in transformation. I know technologists like myself and many of our audience members always lean towards industry best practices. So what are some of the best practices for transformation that you apply to this project, or that could be considered industry best practices?
So I'm not going to pile on what Mig said, but two of them, clearly leadership, that genuine leadership from day one, but day one till the end, extremely important. One of the early failure points that we see in transformations like this is a leader will show up day one and won't show up till the end. And to build off what Mig said, anybody that's been through administration changes know this too shall pass, and they'll ride it out. So there's that genuine leadership which is engaged. I want to build, it was so eloquently put by Mig about the communications. Communications with not only that purpose, but I'm going to go back to the term I used, empathy and compassion, but benefit. And I think I know in the case of the communication program that we put together around this, we continually communicated with those employees and reminded them why they were in it, what it was in it for them. So we didn't get the obligatory eye roll. I've seen this before 20 years ago. It's never going to work. And that really resonated, that communication. But the one thing which, and 100% of the time we get into these org transformations, the first thing that we'll ask for is, what is your vision? What's your transformational vision? What's the people vision? And Mig and her team sat down with us and said, that's a great place for us to start. So we started by crafting what that vision should be for the future, given the nuggets that they had and where they wanted to go. And it was really important. And once that vision was cast, we could always go back through communication and remind people what our North Star was, what our guiding star is. And with those three elements, I would say those were the three things that really led to the success of this particular engagement with the Commonwealth.
So Mig, last question for you I have is, great story, but where does things stand now? We've heard about what you did to get there, but what's the snapshot look like today?
Sure. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is we had some leaders, some that we elevated within the group, and some that we put in place because we recognized early on the importance of having leadership that would work closely with the rest of our team and with the KPMG team, and really take on some of those practices. So some of the practices that were put in place with the engagement that we've continued are things like just kind of regular check-ins, icebreakers during meetings. We started this project during a pandemic, and that wasn't the plan originally. And we made a decision early on in the pandemic to say, we can't wait. This can't wait. We have to move forward. And so we had the additional challenge of having people that for the first time had laptops because we were handing them out. I mean, I was literally in this building handing out laptops, making sure that people had a way to connect, and then on the phone with people trying to help them understand how to use them. So we had that challenge of having people turn on their cameras. We started off with people not even turning on their cameras. So on that, what we've been able to continue through this whole process is having them engaged and really talking to them, keeping everyone engaged and aware, right? One of the pieces of feedback we got is that people are in this like particular lane of what they're doing, but it would be better, and they would really love to know how what they're doing impacts overall, what the group is doing, what the Secretariat is doing. And so keeping those connection points, keeping folks talking, engaged, and engaging them in brainstorming about how to solve problems. So it used to be the reality that leadership would just make decisions, or sometimes it wasn't even within the group. It was somewhere else along the chain that decisions are made. So really engaging the folks that have the knowledge, that have the experience in how we solve problems, that's continued on, and they continue to be engaged and really excited. We have been, throughout this process, we really discovered a better operating structure, and so we've been continue to hire and fill in those positions that are open, and we just continue to move forward. We're continuing to have conversations around how do we continue to connect data in ways that's really going to help our constituents. We started while KPMG was with us, we started reaching out to stakeholders, and that effort has continued. And so we're continuing to have those conversations, really with a clear intention to have our employees feel like, look, reality is always changing, right? We just went through a pandemic. Our reality changed overnight. The reality for our constituents is always changing, depending on what's happening in the market or just in the world in general. And we have to have enough dexterity to pivot to whatever those needs are. It's not necessarily going to be as fast as they would like it to or quickly, but engaging them in those conversations and how we do that, it's honestly, it has changed everything. So we still have a lot of work to do, but I am happy to report that everyone is still incredibly engaged and excited about the future that we are creating for ourselves.
So I'm going to turn it over to our audience members. We got several good questions from our audience. One is for you, Paul, about or I guess Meg, I would like to get your input as well. The employee retention in government workforce, of the future. We spent a lot of time talking about the people element. So what are the keys to growth and retention of the government workforce of the future? Because the future is upcoming, and it's going to be different than new normal.
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead, Meg. Go ahead. Kick it off, and then I'll buffer in.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to share what we have seen on this front. One of the things that we did, I think 2 years ago, as we were starting to really think about, wow, how do we really address culture across our entire secretariat? What does that look like? We did a survey of employees just to understand, like, what is motivating our employees, right? Understanding that some folks kind of just want to come in, clock in, do the work and leave, and others may have a different motivation. To our surprise, there was not a single person that came back and said, what I want is more money. What they all came back with is, I want to know that I helped that person on the other end of the phone or on the other end of the transaction, whatever their goal might be. And when we started to tease that apart, we started to realize that transparency around the role people play in terms of the bigger picture was really key. There were also things that informed us of in terms of a lack of training, right? And I just mean even just soft skills, just kind of management training or communications training. How do you kind of engage with other folks? At the crux of that survey and the work that we've been doing has really been, how do we best provide our employees with the tools that they need to do their work and to engage with each other? And it's really made a huge difference. We also went into this really clearly understanding that with change always comes risk, right? There are folks that are risk averse and may organically transition off, and there are folks that will embrace the change and kind of come with us. But I will tell you, in the conversations that we've had with employees and providing additional training, which we're still ramping up those efforts, but so far they've been really well received, and really helping people understand their roles, giving them more transparency around where we are headed as an organization. All of those pieces has really helped to shift morale. I mean, I'm not going to lie, we are still dealing with the reality of the pandemic and how that has affected our workforce. And there are pieces to that, we're continuing to figure out. But the shift I've seen anyway in the time that I've been here has been that, people are more willing to give us the benefit of the doubt and work with us to improve what I frame as culture for them. It's really just their day-to-day life in terms of what they do when they get to work.
Paul, you got anything to briefly add to that question about the growth retention of the workforce, and also a question from the audience about entry-level talent marketing and recruitment?
Actually, I'll answer both those questions with, I want to build on what Mig said. Prior pandemic, we've been working with workforces for the last 10 years, particularly with government, with the focus on government now. We've started to really do hardcore employee value propositions for government employees, because to Mig's point, everybody wants a purpose for their career and wants to feel good about coming to work, not just helping constituents. So we put together learning plans. We put together journey maps for government employees, which when you think about it, you think, wow, isn't that obvious? No, state and local government, and even the federal space, hasn't taken that approach because typically over the years, that employee base would stay for 30 years, and that was their value proposition. However, growth and retention of the younger workers that need to come in, they weren't buying that. They were saying, I don't want to stay 30 years. I want a reason to be here. I want a reason to grow. I want a reason to help those constituents for the next 30 years, not just because I'm staying for a pension. I'll pause there, Bill.
Well, unfortunately, I want to be respectful of our time commitment, so we have to wrap it up here. This has been a great conversation. If there's any audience questions that we didn't get a chance to address, someone will follow back up with you and address your questions as we can. In closing, I just want to thank my expert speakers, Mig and Paul, for sharing your insights on today's webcast. And also want to thank KPMG for making it possible to have this important webcast discussion today. And most importantly, thank you to our audience for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you again soon at another Government Technology event. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.